Are the billions of dollars and weapons being sent to Ukraine going into right hands? Hello, viewers. Hope you're all doing well. Like I have been discussing here earlier, the war being fought in Ukraine is a very expensive one. The stupendous cost of men, material, artillery, ammunition, and advanced missiles, including the air defense systems, intelligence, humanitarian aid, the other macro financial assistance, it's a lot of money. In my earlier articles for the print, I have discussed where the money is coming from and exactly how much money will be needed. But today, let me ask a fundamentally prudent question. Are the money and the weapons landing where they are supposed to land? Are there any mechanisms in place to oversee how that aid or weapons are being dispersed? And more importantly, does the world need to worry about the nature of the Ukrainian state? So while there has been a lot of analysis around the heroism of the Ukrainian people, the way they're fighting, and justifiably so, there has hardly been enough contemplation or deliberation on the governance institutions of Ukraine's post-Soviet state that freed itself from the tyranny of communism but inherited a prevalent, deep-rooted, almost ubiquitous corruption in almost all aspects of Ukrainian politics, judiciary, and administration. Questions have been raised if the country's infamous post-Soviet legacy of Russian-style kleptocracy, kleptocracy is where leaders use their political power to expropriate the wealth of the people and land they govern, typically by embezzling or misappropriating state resources. So there have been questions if the legacy of Russian-style kleptocracy would exploit this vulnerable situation and impede the judicious distribution of aid money. Do oversight mechanisms exist to ensure a comprehensive review? And if yes, is that enough? Corruption has been ingrained in most post-communist societies in general and the post-Soviet ones in particular. While it's been endemic in Eastern and Central European societies, the stakes are disproportionately higher for Ukraine. Especially now when the country operates in the emergency matrix of fighting off fresh missile attacks almost on a daily basis, it really becomes incumbent upon the West to better regulate its largesse to avoid misappropriation in the channels of delivery. Let's unpack the story within Ukraine. For years, Ukraine has been waging a two-front war. Externally, with Russia's imperialist ambitions, and internally, with the monster of corruption. The dual struggle, although bound in repercussion, is incommensurate in modalities. What I mean to say is that the methods for fighting these two wars are different, even when the objective, that is, the freedom and dignity of the Ukrainian state, is similar. I hope you understand. Focus has unduly been on the externalities. However, unless it is ensured that the demons of favoritism and the ghosts of embezzlement do not unleash amid such dire straits, the purpose of the aid will stand defeated. The protracted war, which means this long-standing war, has made Ukraine a bottomless pit, endlessly absorbing Western aid. The longer the war stretches, the more its own ability to fight systemic corruption gets diminished. Therefore, during the course of the war, mechanisms have been promulgated by the aid givers themselves, which means the West. So the West, especially the US, also has a past. Learning from the disasters in the Middle East, American senators had been pretty cautious with the aid packages to Ukraine. In the early months of the war, around February, March, April, a bill was introduced to establish Special Inspector General to oversee the use of American taxpayer aid to Ukraine. So far, the US aid Ukraine is the best known oversight mechanism that exists to coordinate and oversee the disbursement of American aid. But Is it potent enough to hold individuals or organizations accountable for any waste or fraud or abuse of billions of dollars in aid? Actually, we do not know yet. US aid's major focus lies on humanitarian aid and relief packages and less on overseeing hardcore military assistance. Unless coordinated tightly at an interagency level across all kinds of aid from all kinds of sources, mischief makers might exploit the cleavages. So, malefactors have been lying low under a series of reforms initiated by the Ukrainian government after the Euromaidan protests in 2014. But money apart, with stocks of Soviet weapons at its disposal, Ukraine had acquired the notorious reputation of illegal arms trafficking in the early years of its independence. This issue was raised by a report in the Washington Post persuading the Biden administration to keep track of all the weapons being sent to Ukraine, but sadly, to not much avail. There also have been worrying reports of weaponry sent to Ukraine amid the ongoing war, which is ending up in black markets or being sold on darknet platforms also. The West cannot really turn a blind eye. But Ukraine is not being hailed just like that. The awakening of Slava Ukraini, that translates to, victory to Ukraine or hail Ukraine, that spirit has been in the making for a decade. Since its independence, which is 1991, Ukraine has tried to weed out its legacy of corruption. Especially after 2014, the country's anti-corruption mechanisms have developed steadily with an objective to integrate with the European Union. Of course, it still remains an unfinished project. What sets Ukraine apart from other members of the post-Soviet constellation is its people's desire to entrench a fair, democratic system. This desire perhaps saw initial glory in the successful reinstating of a popularly elected Viktor Yushchenko as president against Kremlin-backed candidate Viktor Yanukovych. The series of protests that shook Kyiv came to be known as the 2004 Orange Revolution. But the exultation was short-lived as Yushchenko could do little to fight the menace of corruption that had perpetuated throughout Ukrainian polity and society right from the years of the first president, Leonid Kravchuk, and his successors. Presidents changed as corruption kept thriving in the country when the earlier defeated Yanukovych made a comeback in 2010 and catapulted personal, political, and legal corruption to new heights. Incidentally, the man behind his successful comeback was Paul Manafort, who later served as, guess who? Donald Trump's campaign manager. Manafort reportedly made millions in Yanukovych's comeback. Interesting. Let's now fast forward to 2014, the time of Euromaidan and Ukraine's fight for its dignity. The precipitating factor behind Yanukovych's ousting was Ukraine's efforts to sign an association agreement with the EU. While the majority population in Ukraine supported it, Yanukovych's chief patron Russia did not, and obviously. Eventually, under Russian pressure, he backed away from the EU pact. And that did not go down well with the Ukrainian people, who saw their future with a more egalitarian, democratic, and affluent West, that is, the European Union. So, as the economy collapsed and poverty rose, Ukrainians were forced to fight for their dignity. A series of reforms have been underway ever since Viktor Yanukovych, the most corrupt president in the history of Ukraine, fled to Russia. So, the reforms have been aimed at strengthening the institutions of governance. Results so far have been a mixed bag with an overall impressive progress. I'll tell you how. One of the most promising developments has been the gas market reforms. Run by corrupt officials, Ukraine's largest natural oil and gas company, Naftogaz, had largely been responsible for creating a domestic reliance on Russian imported gas by penalizing domestic gas production and discouraging efficient methods, basically. In a complete turnaround, Naftogaz began reporting profits to the tune of, say, $1 billion annually, and in 2018, it accounted for 19% of state revenue. Just before the war broke out, its profits had shot up to $12 billion in 2021. But Moscow did not like this efficient Naftogaz that was no longer reliant on it. Russia had been isolating Ukraine by direct pipelines to Germany via the Nord Streams, the Nord Stream 1 and 2. It also refused to extend Russian state-owned Gazprom's gas transit contract with Naftogaz after the current one expires, and all this happened before the war. Coming to the tax reforms in Ukraine, they have been aimed at eliminating various tax holes, and thereby they've been saving about $1 billion for Kyiv annually. Reforms such as electronic filing for VAT have worked pretty well. Ukraine's struggle with greater government accountability also has seen progress. Going digital, electronic system of public procurements was introduced in 2014 that has drastically reduced corruption in bidding for the country's government contracts. Banking reforms have reduced banks' involvements in money laundering Ponzi schemes, focusing on strict anti-money laundering laws and tighter control over cash flows. Judicial reforms, too, began in 2014, but they have not really been sufficient to tackle the structural faults in the system. The strategy for reforming the justice system from 2015 to 2020, a 5-year strategy, was approved in May 2015 that paved the way for reinstating rule of law. It was all still a work in progress when the war began. Ukraine's deregulation mechanisms have abolished, traffic police inspectorate and real estate registration agencies that really bred corruption. Doing away with the corrupt police system of Yanukovych era, Ukraine has put in what is called the patrol police system that reflects striving for transparency in law enforcement mechanisms as well. Now, let's discuss Ukraine's current president, Volodymyr Zelensky's record at fighting corruption. That too has been a rather mixed bag. Although he managed to fulfill one corruption campaign promise by lifting the law that prevented members of the parliament from being prosecuted, there is much ground that needs to be covered. Zelensky's own popularity ratings had also taken a dip before the war as some charges of personal corruption had surfaced. I think it suffices to argue that although unfinished, Ukraine's fight against internal corruption is a painstakingly long process of strengthening institutions where a robust civil society will always play a cardinal role. So, what should the West do? In the absence of effective oversight mechanisms for aid and weaponry, the West's taxpayers will forever be under the looming shadow of doubt and uncertainty. As the war stretches on with no end in sight, more money and more weapons will flow to sustain Ukraine in this war against Russia. Ukraine's internal fight against corruption, although mired in several challenges I just told you about, is likely to resume as the war-tattered country will be putting itself together again with Western aid. The war in Ukraine has far-reaching implications for Europe, for transatlantic ties, and the world at large. Meanwhile, assigning a permanent special inspector general for Ukraine and setting up an effective interagency task force to oversee not only humanitarian but also military aid should be pursued. So, viewers, taxpayers across the allied countries deserve a closure from US's financial misadventures in Iraq and Afghanistan. The right oversight mechanisms can provide that. I'll be analyzing those developments and more And we'll be back soon again with another intersectional vertical in today's geopolitics. Stay tuned.